First, they understood, and we have lost, accountability. Take an example that's not too recent, not so recent as to be controversial, the Clean Air Act, which the Congress in 1970 adopted or amended to force technological development by requiring automobile manufacturers to effect a 90% reduction in pollution emissions within 5 years, with devastating penalties for noncompliance, and absolutely no idea whether it could be done. But not wanting to be blamed either for failing to reach that goal or for destroying the industry, they delegated to the EPA authority to extend the deadline if necessary. And the EPA denied their request when the time came, and the companies came where? To the DC Circuit. And it fell to Judge Harold Leventhal, a distinguished jurisprudence, but I know from personal experience not much of an auto mechanic, to evaluate data from 500 test vehicles comparing a variety of approaches to catalytic conversion, none of which I understand, and none of which you would understand if I were to read them to you. It was the Court of Appeals, not the people's representatives, not even the bureaucrats at the EPA, who balanced the environmental costs of pollution against the economic cost to the auto industry. It was the Court of Appeals that decided whether to extend the deadline. To be sure, the court did so with an admission of doubts and diffidence, but nonetheless, it did so. Thus did the quasi-parliamentary system that has evolved result in a government of buck passing. The president lacks control over the policies of his nominal subordinates, all too often, when they're acting as the agents of the Congress. The Congress can claim to have delivered clean air or whatever, but disclaim the costs of achieving that goal, or if the goal is not achieved, disclaim responsibility for failure. The hard decisions are left to the agencies and ultimately to the courts, which have neither the legitimate authority nor the resources to evaluate complex policy matters or to balance costs and benefits to American society. Moreover, judicial decisions taken in this manner are made with neither energy and dispatch nor public deliberation, but as Judge Leventhal said, with doubts and diffidence. So the Supreme Court, understandably, is uncomfortable with the judiciary playing this role and has adopted a strategy of extreme deference to the legal conclusions of the agencies. In Chevron, the court upbraided the petitioners for, quote, waging in a judicial forum a specific policy battle which they ultimately lost in the agency, but one which was never waged in the Congress, close quote. The cost of taking the courts out of such policy battles was greater delegation to the agencies. The Endangered Species Act makes it unlawful to take an animal on the list of endangered or threatened species. And the DC Circuit held that the EPA permissibly interpreted the word take to prohibit significant habitat modification. I'm sorry, the Supreme Court did, reversing the DC Circuit. There's a take means also to engage in significant habitat modification, because to take includes to harm, and the animal could be harmed by the alteration of its habitat. Therefore, the Congress meant to delegate to the agency, and the agency permissibly held that altering the habitat is taking the animal. Okay. Second, the framers understood, and we have forgotten, that democracy is weakened when the locus of policymaking shifts from the legislature or Congress to an agency. Theodore Lowy, political scientist, has argued the delegation of policy problems to administrative agencies fosters the atrophy of the institutions of popular control, because agency heads exercise their discretion in accordance with relationships between agencies and interest groups rather than the full range of national priorities. Indeed, the point of the non-delegation doctrine was to keep the locus of lawmaking power in the Congress, where the requirements of bicameralism and presentment assure connection to the public will. If the Congress had to vote on the Code of Federal Regulations rule by rule, much if not most of it would surely fail. Yet those rules have the force of law without the Congress having voted at all. Instead, a phalanx of administrative officers in the executive, working most closely with their congressional oversight committees and the industries they regulate, write the rules that govern the various spheres of American life, indeed, almost all of them now. Third and last, the framers understood, and we have lost, the energy that is the distinguishing characteristic of a unitary, independent executive. Hamilton, Federalist 70. That unity is conducive to energy will not be disputed. Decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch will generally characterize the proceedings of one man in a much more eminent degree than the proceedings of any greater number, and in proportion as the number is increased, those qualities will be diminished, and indeed they have been. Jurisdiction over the use and handling of formaldehyde, to take one little example, something that we encounter in our everyday lives, is shared among, you don't realize it, it's shared among the EPA, the OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Food and Drug Administration, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the Housing and Urban Development Department, each of which in its regulations applies different assumptions concerning key variables such as the value of a statistical life and the potency of a given concentration. And these are not the so-called independent agencies. These are all squarely within the executive branch. Yet each carries out a mandate from the Congress directly to the agency, and those congressional delegations displace the leadership of the executive. The lack of presidential control over the independent agencies is explicit. And so it is that the Secretary of Treasury today can promise swift action to restore confidence in the banking system, but cannot secure the cooperation of the independent FDIC, CFTC, or Securities and Exchange Commission. With the courts on the sidelines, what force is left to resist erosion of the accountability, democracy, and energy that the framers intended? The President may not always resist delegations of authority to executive agencies, certainly not always with success. But at least when the Congress attempts to dictate policies to the executive and to those agencies, every American president, without exception, has advanced the constitutional principle that the executive is unitary, long before Dick Cheney. Most recently, President Obama's administration has pursued two principal strategies to strengthen his control over the executive. First, he's tried to insulate policymaking in the executive branch from legislative control. In his first year, he has appointed about twice as many czars as the Romanov dynasty had in 300 years. They help to formulate the president's policies on everything from economic recovery to peace in the Middle East. And they operate outside the morass of congressional oversight and agency rulemaking. Second, like his predecessors, President Obama has taken to issuing signing statements. Some of you may recall that he said he wouldn't do that, but that was a lapse of the tongue. So the signing statements have said, for example, that he is not bound to press for congressionally prescribed policies within international organizations, or to follow statutory format requirements for budget requests, or to accept congressional limitations upon the appointments of a commission, or to condition American participation in UN peacekeeping missions upon the approval of U.S. military leaders, or to honor whistleblower protections for federal employees who give information to the Congress. Predictably, the czars and the signing statements have raised hackles in the Congress, which understandably prefers to have its own way in matters of policy. But so does the president, any president, every president. That, in the end, is the last, and for that reason alone, the best hope for our system of separated powers. As Madison put it, the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others, close quote. With the constitutional means now lost, that great security has come down to personal motive, that is, to the fortitude of the president. Thank you.